So, Boris Johnson is going to be back in the news this week, and he is going to be front and centre. He's going to be back in the news in a big way, because he is going to be sitting in front of the Privileges Select Committee. And, depending on what the Privileges Select Committee recommend, depending on what the House of Commons do, he could be subject to the Recall of MPs Act 2015. So, what is the House of Commons Select Committee on Privileges? It is the committee responsible for investigating MPs who are alleged to have committed a contempt of Parliament. It is different from the Standards Committee, which investigates other types of wrongdoing. The Standards Committee also has lay members, so people who aren't MPs who have input into that process. They used to be the same committee, they were split up relatively recently. So the committee will carry out investigations, write reports, and make a recommendation to the House of Commons. Now, the Select Committee, as with all other Select Committees, is cross-party. It's made up of members of different parties, and there is at the moment a Conservative majority on that Select Committee. Notably, Chris Bryant, who used to be the chair of that committee, recused himself, which means stepped down, because he'd been so openly critical of Boris Johnson over Partygate. So, whilst this committee is made up of MPs, it is meant to be an independent committee looking at the evidence rather than the politics of what is happening. So, as you will know, there was the big scandal of Partygate during lockdown. And upon completion of the Met Police's investigation, which saw Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak receiving a fixed penalty notice, and the Sue Gray report, Sue Gray was a civil servant who was tasked with doing an independent report into Partygate. When those two things were over, the issue was referred to the House of Commons Privileges Committee. And they are considering a specific area of this relating to the House of Commons. So they are considering what Boris Johnson said to the House of Commons about these events, whether what he said was correct or whether it was misleading, how quickly and comprehensively any misleading statement was corrected, and if it is established that he did mislead the House, whether it was contempt of the House, was impeding its ability to scrutinise the government, and therefore they should take further action or recommend further action to the House of Commons. Now, misleading the House of Commons is a serious offence. It's something you cannot do. You cannot deliberately mislead the House of Commons, and if you inadvertently mislead the House of Commons, you're expected to correct the record as soon as possible. Just for example, Ed Davey last week, he mentioned a case from his constituency in the House of Commons, and then he realised he hadn't got the details quite right, so he returned to the House of Commons to correct the record. That's the normal process if you have misled the House of Commons. Now, the committee have already carried out their initial report, and it does indicate that Boris Johnson may, in their view, have misled the House of Commons on 4 separate occasions. And on Thursday, Boris Johnson is going to be in front of that committee giving evidence, and he's going to have to try to explain what he said to the House, why he said it, and whether he was misleading the House or not. Why is this important? Because the Recall of MPs Act 2015 may come into effect. The Recall of MPs Act was passed in 2015 under the Coalition to give a mechanism to recall MPs from Parliament who've done something wrong, so to stop them being MPs anymore. Now, it is rather limited. You can only be recalled as an MP if one of 3 criteria are met. Firstly, if an MP is convicted of a criminal offence and has received a prison sentence, even if it's not a custodial sentence, even if it's suspended. Number 2, if an MP is barred from the House of Commons for 10 sitting days or 14 calendar days, as decided by the Committee on Standards. And number 3, if an MP is convicted of providing false or misleading expenses claims, regardless of whether they are imprisoned. So if an MP meets any of those 3 criteria, then a recall petition will be opened by the Speaker of the House of Commons. It's open for 6 weeks, and if 10% of the MP's constituents sign that petition, then that MP will be recalled, their seat will be vacant, they will no longer be an MP, and a by-election will be called. Now, so far, there have been 3 MPs who've been subject to a recall petition. Ian Paisley Jr. was the first. However, 10% of his constituents, did not sign the petition, so he remains an MP. Fiona Onasanya received a custodial prison sentence for perverting the course of justice after lying about a speeding offence, and there was a by-election which she did not run in, and she was removed as an MP. And Christopher Davies, who had an expenses-related conviction 18.9% of people voted for his petition, but he still tried to run again in the by-election. But perhaps unsurprisingly, he lost to Jane Dodds, the Liberal Democrat candidate. So they are the three so far who have faced recall petitions. Boris Johnson may be the fourth. And the statistics from his constituency aren't looking good. Boris Johnson does not have a super strong majority. He doesn't have the kind of majority that someone as senior as him within the party normally has, or quite often has. And it's hard to imagine, if he is subject to the recall petitions process, the recall of MPs process, that he will not get 10% of his constituents signing that recall petition. I think given the profile of his case, I think that's almost a guarantee. So what's going to matter really is what the House of Commons do, if the report is referred to the House of Commons. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Rishi Sunak has said he's going to give his MPs a free vote on Boris Johnson's future. You might remember, a couple of years ago, Boris Johnson tried to whip his MPs not to vote for a suspension for Owen Paterson, and that got him in a lot of trouble. So Rishi Sunak is giving a free vote, he says, on Boris Johnson if the case comes to the House of Commons. However, there will be a number of MPs, quite a number perhaps, who are going to loyally stand behind Boris Johnson. They're going to call this a stitch-up. They're going to talk about how Sue Gray has now been appointed as Chief of Staff to the Labour Party and say that this is just a witch hunt to get rid of the former Prime Minister. And that is going to be dangerous for Rishi Sunak because it's going to highlight real divisions within his party. So next week's going to be really interesting, but what happens after that is going to be even more interesting to see how this process unfolds. For my money, if I'm honest, I think Boris Johnson is in a lot of trouble. I think he will struggle to remain an MP by the end of the summer. But it'll be interesting to see how it unfolds.